Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks to Jesse Patterson, Hamish MacLeod, and Paul Anderson for inviting us. Given the topic of our talk, we think you're the perfect audience, and we also know people working in informatics can be very critical, so that's a very good opportunity for getting some feedback. So just to say a few things about us, we work next door at the philosophy department on the Extended Knowledge project, where we're trying to combine epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and other related concepts such as justification, with an interesting hypothesis from philosophy of mind and cognitive science known as the extended cognition hypothesis, which says that occasionally, under the appropriate conditions, our minds may extend beyond our brains to the technology and artifacts that we use. And obviously that can have very interesting ramifications on what we can know and how we might acquire knowledge. But today we want to say a little bit about what might be the ethical and possibly legal ramifications of thinking about our minds in this way.
Thanks. So thinking about cognition as potentially including parts of the external world is obviously going to have some motivations for thinking provocatively about what it is to harm another individual. And it's going to require that we rethink in certain important ways what it is to harm another individual. Now, harm is a rather wide class of offense. And so for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus on a particular class of harm, which is personal assault. And we think that if the hypothesis of extended cognition is true, it's going to turn out they're going to have to rethink seriously what it is to personally assault another individual. First, just a bit of ground clearing. The traditional thinking about assault is actually very simple. In Fagan versus Metropolitan Police, this is a ruling that's used in a lot of U.S. cases. Personal assault involves the actual intended use of unlawful force to another person without his consent. Now, oftentimes, you don't have to stop and ask, well, who's the person? Because that's pretty obvious. It's to think of it as the biological individual. So the question, what constitutes the person in cases of assault, is often taken for granted rather than explicitly addressed. Now, it was, in fact, addressed in one case in the UK. This is from over 100 years ago, and this still is one that's pervasive in current UK law. The idea that Judge Hobhouse says is that the body of the victim includes all parts of the body, including his organs, nervous system, and his brain. Bodily injury, therefore, may include injury to any of these parts of his body responsible for his mental or other faculties. Well, notice that the idea of parts of a body responsible for mental or other faculties, that lends itself to a kind of a functionalist characterization. Perhaps it's something that's not biological, that's in part responsible for your mental or other faculties. However, the traditional assumption, right, is that even though we have this functionalist idea of what it might be to harm another individual by harming the parts of one that are responsible for one's mental or other faculties, we tend to think that it's just biological parts of an individual that can play this kind of a functional role. Accordingly, traditional thinking leads us to say, well, when we think of assault, we think immediately of cases like this, where you're doing direct harm intentionally to someone's biologically constituted parts. We think of the second case as nothing maybe even close to personal assault. Well, that's just hurting someone's property. That's a harm of a different kind. Certainly isn't personal assault. We think that there are very good reasons to endorse certain views in contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive science on which this distinction becomes rather blurred. And in fact, in certain cases, not all, we want to claim that, in fact, cases of the latter variety are in the relevant respect similar to the cases of the former variety. And in fact, we think, with reference to certain legal cases in the last 10 years, that the law is quickly going to be becoming very different on this score.
So, just to see how we can think about artifacts as being parts of our minds, a few words about this extended cognition hypothesis, according to which, under the appropriate conditions, when we mutually interact with artifacts, such as iPhones, telescopes, microscopes, I will be giving more examples in a while, they might count as proper parts of our cognitive systems. Now, there are several ways to understand this hypothesis and try and motivate it, But we think that perhaps the most informative and accurate way is in terms of dynamical systems theory, which is the kind of mathematics that Newton introduced to account for his mechanics and which are used all over science across several disciplines. And the reason for this focus on dynamical systems theory is that, according to it, if we want to say that several distinct parts give rise to an overall system that consists of all of them at the same time, what we need to do is to make sure that they're non-linearly related with each other on the basis of mutual interactions between them. And the reason why these mutual interactions are necessary is because they give rise to some new systemic properties that do not belong to any of the subcomponents, but instead they belong to their ongoing interaction, such that if we want to account for these new systemic properties, we will have to postulate the overall system. So that's one reason, and then another reason, which might be thought as the flip side of the coin, is that they also make it impossible to decompose the overall system in distinct parts in terms of distinct inputs and outputs from the one part to the other. And so if we really want to understand why the parts behave the way they behave, in the end we won't be able but postulate the overall system. So that's the idea. What we need to say that several parts give rise to an overall cognitive system is that they mutually interact with each other. And to see how this condition might have an effect in real case scenarios, it means that we cannot really say that phone books and directory services may extend our memory such that we can know or believe what the phone number of everyone whose number is listed is. The reason being that whenever we interact with them, actually the causal effect is only one way from the artifact to our cognitive systems. There are no mutual interactions involved, so they won't qualify as cases of cognitive extension. And the same goes for shopping lists, for instance, because even though we do create shopping lists for use at a later time, when we actually are at the grocery store, we don't really mutually interact with them, we just read from them. And again, the causal effect is just one way. So cases like these won't qualify, but there are so many other cases that will. So I think the best example is the case of tactile visual substitution systems, which are a pair of sunglasses that have a mini video camera attached to them that converts visual input into tactile stimulation under the agent's tongue. And so in this way, the agent, by moving around in space and interacting with the device, he gets to have perceptual experiences that are very similar to visual experience. So that's one case of cognitive extension. And then a very similar case, but way more low-tech, is the blind patient with his cane. And similar things can be said about microscopes, telescopes. Another very interesting case is the case of the magnetic belt, where subjects perceive the direction of the magnetic north as vibrations around their waist. And also after a while, they have reported that they start perceiving magnetic north as a distinct object out there, in the same way that the objects of our visual perception, we don't perceive them as stimulation on our retinas, but as objects out there. And again, I think Google Glasses may qualify. Interestingly, pen and paper qualifies when we try to solve a complex mathematical problem, and of course, on many occasions, when we use our laptops. So all these are cases that will qualify as cognitive extension on the basis of the mutual interactions criterion. And so what we want to suggest, the overall argument, is that if a sufficient condition for something counting as personal assault is that it be intentional harm to a part of a person responsible for his mental and other faculties, and if we also accept the hypothesis of extended cognition, according to which our mental faculties can be partly constituted by external artifacts when those artifacts are integrated on the basis of mutual interactions between our organismic cognitive faculties and then we can say that if one compromises any such integrated epistemic artifacts, then actually one does not merely damage the artifact, but actually compromises our mental faculties such that having our integrated epistemic artifacts intentionally compromised will plausibly count as a case of personal assault.
And unfortunately, given this kind of thinking, it's natural to worry that the law is going to be falling behind. And the law is, in fact, falling behind at an increasing rate, given how many new gadgets we mutually interact with. There's a lot more gadgets that we interact with, and the types of ways that Oreatis was mentioning constitute coupled cognitive systems than there were even 10 years ago. A worry then is this: we have a proliferation of technology that we mutually interact with. We can only imagine that in the next 10 years, for instance, there's going to be even more technology that we offload our memory to and that we causally interact with in mutual ways. Accordingly, with the increase in the number of gadgets that we causally interact with in this two-way type of cognitive extension, there's going to be more corresponding cases of extended cognition, of bona fide extended cognition. And accordingly, with more cases of actual extended cognition, there's going to be an increased urgency and the need to eliminate bioprejudice in the law. Bioprejudice, again, being the type of prejudice that's revealed when one assumes that the only thing that can play the functional role of sustaining or underwriting our mental lives are our biological parts. As it turns out, there are some cases that are indicating a change to the way of thinking that we're suggesting, although in some respects just at the level of metaphor. So a recent case in the U.S., Chief Justice Roberts says in Riley versus California, he says, quote, "Modern cell phones are now such a pervasive and insistent part of the daily life that proverbial visitors from Mars might conclude that they were an important feature of human anatomy. And on the basis of this rationale, Roberts suggests that it is inappropriate to search the contents of one's cellular or mobile phone." In the background, there's a type of thinking that's very similar to what we've been suggesting, which is that once you interact with something in a type of way that it causally interacts in both directions, it seems as though this is, in relevant respects, a part of you. Roberts actually wanted to treat the contents of the cell phone as, in the relevantly analogous respect, the contents of one's mind, in the sense that we have a certain privacy to our own thoughts, and this privacy, in this Riley versus California, suggested it would extend also to the contents of one's mobile device. Unfortunately, though, the law isn't changing quickly enough, and we have a lot of cases in the law where bioprejudice in the law that doesn't appreciate bona fide cases of extended cognition leads to the wrong kinds of verdicts. And one case that's particularly interesting is the case of Neil Harbison. Now, Neil Harbison was unfortunately born with a condition where he can only perceive the world monochromatically. He can't see any colors, and everything appears to him visually grayscale. He is a cyber activist who has tried to do something about this, and he's got a camera that's attached through his skull which allows him to sense color through sound. So he perceives a colored world through sound through this camera that is integrated into his skull. Now, unsurprisingly, this looks a little bit strange. And there is a case in which it looked to some police officers as though Neil Harbison is, what is he doing with this camera? He's video recording us. Officers detained him, and in the process, they broke his camera. The question I want to ask is, what kind of harm was done to Neil Harbison when his camera was broken? Now, based on the type of rationale we've been offering, it depends. It depends on cognitive integration. In the case of Neil Harbison, this is part of his perceptual experience. This is part of his perceptual faculty with reference to extended cognition. You've done more to Neil Harbison, given that his camera is integrated into his cognitive system, than you would in a corresponding case where you imagine everything is held fixed, but he doesn't have this condition and he just happened to strap a camera to his head. That is not a case of extended cognition. There's no two-way mutual interaction. There is in this case, and so we think that the law should plausibly treat these two cases differently. Treat Harbison's case as a case of personal assault, whereas we wouldn't treat a case of personal assault one where we simply break the camera.
So to summarize all these ideas, what we're suggesting is that not every case where we use an artifact is going to count as a case of cognitive extension. So if someone breaks your newly purchased laptop, this is not really going to count as a case of physical assault. They probably have to buy you a new one, but it's not really a physical assault. Whereas if someone messes up with John's laptop, that we can imagine he has been interacting with it for a few months now, and so he has moved the files around, and he has set up some shortcuts, notifications. He has set up how the mouse pad is going to behave. He has decided where the downloaded files will be saved. He has ordered how the files will be ordered. In other words, he has tailored his laptop in such a specific way that allows him to mutually interact with it in the way that dynamical systems theory will allow it to count as part of his cognitive system. Then we might say that if you actually damage John's laptop, then it is plausible, or at least a little bit more plausible, to claim that it might be a case of personal assault. So these are experimental and new ideas, and we think that even if in the end we have to give them up, at least they're worth thinking about them. So we'll stop and see what you might think, given your background and personal experiences as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And questions? Yeah, at the back.
Thank you. Kieran Leach, EPCC. I just wonder whether this isn't perhaps a matter of redefining what we consider assistive devices. Neil Harbison's issue is perhaps similar to the issue of if the police had thought he was recording them and so smashed his hearing aid on the sidewalk, if that makes any sense. So is there perhaps a possibility of considering these devices and extended condition to come under that category? And I'm not sure. And my other question is, do you know how that category is currently dealt with? Because I imagine there are similarities.
What category is that you mentioned?
Of assistive devices such as hearing aids.
So hearing aids would probably qualify as cases of cognitive extension at some point. There is another case of a flight company that there was a person that was quadriplegic. When you paralyzed legs and all your limbs.
Quadriplegic?
So he was in a flight, and then the flight company, they damaged his device, and there has been a legal case where they just gave him the minimum wage, which was about £1,500. But this person was without his device for about 6 months, and they just said that, well, we didn't really do anything to you, we just damaged your property, just as if we have lost your suitcase. And it does seem to be unfair. Similarly, so for the devices, like hearing devices, you might say that they might count as cases of cognitive extension. So I don't know, you probably suggest that those devices...
My understanding is they already have a protection under the law, and my question is whether that is the protection that is expanded.
Well, all devices have a protection under the law, but we suggest that maybe now the protection should be of a different kind. That's the idea, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, very interesting talk. It felt to me rather as though you seem to be conflating two things which, at least to my untutored view, seem to be quite different. On the one hand, you're talking about things which are part of one's perceptual equipment, the stuff by which you get information from the outside world. Neil Harbison wasn't really having a two-way interaction via his camera. He wasn't putting information out, but he was using it in an important way to get information in. And on the other hand, stuff like your personalized laptop, which you are using in a two-way data flow sense So the one hand is the one is operational and the other is data, and it seems very odd to me to put those under the same umbrella. You're probably too young to remember filofaxes, but it seems to me that there's a spectrum from a shopping list where I might tick off items as I've bought them and thereby satisfy your two-way criterion, through my filofax where I might write down addresses that are of interest to me, and perhaps all the way through to a telephone book where I might, tear out pages I'm not interested in. But those things are different from Neil Harbison's camera, it seemed to me. Any comments?
Thanks a lot. So our suggestion, right, is that there should be a more nuanced and in some senses a more radically nuanced type of assault law that is sensitive to whether, in fact, there is two-way interaction. Now, if it turns out, so on the view that we're recommending, in a case like Neil Harbison, what they should do is, rather than treat all cases of breaking a gadget the same, a further question that's relevant to the matter of whether or not what we have here is actual assault is whether or not there's two-way interaction in place. It might be that in the details of the case, because it's a rather complicated scenario that Harbison's got going on with the way I think it's through ultraviolet sound experience. There's quite a few details. If it turns out that there's not two-way interaction, then no, it shouldn't be treated as a case of personal assault if just the camera is compromised on our proposal. So the question that should be asked is there cognitive integration in play with respect to an external device? And if yes, then it should be treated as part of the person's, just as though it were something that were biological part of the agent.
So also, I do agree with Adam on that. But about your specific comment that we might be mixing two different types of cases. In the case of Neil Harbison, you might say that he does mutually interact with the device. After all, like, he decides where he's going to direct it. And by moving it around and directing it at the right places, he gets a different input. So he does generate some kind of output, which then recycles as input to his own device and his own cognitive system. And then you get this feedback loop, this mutual interaction between the two of them, that you might say actually does constitute, does allow. You just. That's maybe not the case, because then the output of the camera doesn't have an effect on the person who is taking the pictures. There is this mutual interaction, like Harbison affects the camera and the camera affects him back. Another small point that you probably made is that it's more operational in his case, you said, whereas in the other cases data is involved. But in philosophy of mind, there is this tendency towards going away from the computational approach to the mind or cognition, which it's only about data and representations. And lately people have started thinking that maybe representation or data or computation might also be analogical and not just digital, not just on the basis. So if you allow for this understanding of cognition, then simple operations, analogical operations, could be part of computation and by cognition as well.
So I'm over here. You mentioned systems theory at the beginning and sort of predicated a lot of the argument on that. There were two prerequisites to think of something as a system. One was the interaction, but the second was that it ought to be non-linear. And it's not clear to me how you even start to show that some of these interactions are either linear or non-linear.
So whether something is linear or non-linear actually depends on whether there are mutual interactions between them. That's all it takes, feedback loops, either positive or negative. And sometimes there might be also feed-forward loops. But whenever, because those feedback loops, they disallow to decompose the system in an additive way by, taking the properties of all the subcomponents and putting them together.
So you're supposing that any interaction backward and forward has a feedback loop?
Whenever there are mutual interactions, then there is bound to be feedback loops.
Great talk, guys. What about organic things? So just say I've got a guide dog and someone beats up my guide dog. Does that count?
Guide dog if you're blind.
Oh, yeah. So that's a very interesting case which might fall under the category of distributed cognition, which is very similar to the hypothesis of extended cognition, but this time the cognitive system extends to not only include artifacts, but other individuals as well. So I'd say that the pair of a person and riding a horse, or a blind person and a guiding dog, would count as cases of distributed cognition, and also scientific research teams where everyone is collaborating. There are many interesting cases like that, and there is a name for this within philosophy mind. It is the hypothesis of distributed cognition.
I think we've got time for one more question, I think, from someone.
I suspect distributed cognition might be the answer to my question as well. I was going to ask if the extension of the mind via the computer is uploadable, say, to the cloud, is there then a responsibility in the individual to do that uploading, and does that affect our ethical stance towards them? If you see what I mean. Don't ask me to say it again.
So thus far we've been thinking in terms of the sort of mutual causal interactions that occur with physical items such as a computer. That's an excellent question about the cloud. I think that in principle there shouldn't be a reason to exclude interactions with the cloud as a form of extended cognition. I actually haven't thought about that yet, although I would be inclined to take a liberal perspective on it and think that there's no reason not to include interactions with the cloud, potentially, if they satisfy the right types of conditions. It would have to be, of course, different from normal causal conditions because of obvious reasons. But I would think that a plausible, inclusive account of extended cognition would allow, in principle, such cases to be ruled in.
So that, and also, actually we have been thinking about it, but we are quite unsure about it. The idea is that the cloud, if the cloud can represent this mutual functionality, which is what allows us to count towards having been integrated with the cognitive system, then you might say that yes, if that's a possibility, then everyone will have the ethical responsibility of backing up a system. And sorry? It would reduce the... So that's what I'm saying. But there is this, you know what, many times we interact with our computers so much during the day. So if the cloud could do that continuously and monitor every single... Then you might say that, so long as the cloud has a backup of your computer, then if someone damages your computer, that's okay because everything is safe. But if something has gone wrong and there is no backup, then maybe there would be an extra consideration for thinking that, well, now that counts as a case of personal assault. And if someone damages the thing that allows the cloud to work properly, then that might be personal assault for maybe everyone who is safe on the cloud.
I should also add that your question about the cloud has, I think, just given us an idea for a new paper, so thank you.
I think on that note, I'm going to thank Adam and Oreatis again. And they will be around at lunchtime, so if anybody wants to extend the conversation, they're more than willing to speak. So I'm going to ask our next couple of speakers to come up, Avril and David. Thank you.